Let's get going. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. We're all over the place today for our November 2024 installment of Black, Brown and Green Voices. The first thing to remind people is that closed captions are enabled, so please click on the closed caption button on the screen if you need that facility. I'm Dr. Miriam Nyhan, and I'm honoured to be with you today to share in an important conversation about a wonderful new book. I'll just make sure you can see it here in the frame, Revolution by Fire, New York's Afro-Irish Uprising of 1741, a graphic novel. And we're in for such a treat today, not only to have Marcus with us, a renowned scholar of African-American history, and David, who has brought so much life into the pages and voices of and story of this really fascinating historical moment and a time and energy that I think is all the more relevant to the times that we're living in. So just a few housekeeping things before I hand over to my colleague, Professor Kim DaCosta from NYU's and African American Irish Diaspora Network. We are recording today's event, so if anyone would like to watch back later, it will be published on YouTube, and we will share it with people who've registered. About 100 people registered for today's event, so we'll gladly share that. Our archive of events, we've been working on public programming in this vein now since actually spring 2020, so we're almost into our 5th year. And if you'd like to explore the archive, just go to www.blackbrownandgreen.com. We'll run for about 60 minutes or so. For the first 35, 40 minutes, we'll kind of engage in conversation here on the screen. But please do, we'd love to hear your questions and comments in the chat. So please don't be shy about intervening and asking some questions. We really have two great minds with us here today to reflect on this wonderful project. I'd just like to thank our teams at New York University, NYPL Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and of course our colleagues at African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this program. And these programs couldn't be brought to you in the way that they are without the support of the Irish government through the Immigrant Support Program, and we're always very indebted for their support of this project. Our promotional partners at NYU's John Braidmas Center, at New York University's Office for Global Inclusion, and our friends at New York Public Library Schomburg Center are really important to us. And without further ado, then I'll hand over to my colleague, Kim DaCosta, with whom I've collaborated on these activities for a number of years now. And Kim is going to introduce our speakers today. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Miriam. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Marcus Rediker, who is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His Histories from Below have won numerous awards and been translated into 19 languages worldwide. He's the author of 15 books, including The Many-Headed Hydra with Peter Linnebaugh, and The Slave Ship, A Human History, which won the George Washington Book Prize. He's worked with Paul Buell and artist David Lester to produce 3 graphic novels since 2021. Been busy. The most recent of which is the topic of our conversation today, Revolution by Fire, published by Beacon Press. David Lester's graphic novels have been published in 9 languages and include 1919, A Graphic History of the Winnipeg General Strike, and 2 books created with Marcus Rediker and Paul Buell, Prophet Against Slavery, and Under the Banner of King Death. He's a guitarist in the punk rock duo Mecco Normal, cited as an influence on the founders of the feminist social movement, Riot Girl. His poster of anti-war protester Malachi Richer was exhibited at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and he lives in Vancouver, currently working on a graphic biography of Emma Goldman and a graphic book on the Amistad Uprising. So lots more to come from David. Can't wait to hear the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks again, folks, for joining us. This is such a wonderful tool in our exploration through these programs and through our work of the intersections of, in particular, the African American and Irish American experience. And it's real privilege to showcase work grounded in history and presented in this really accessible way and fun way and really beautiful way in terms of a compelling read. It's something that you can't put down when you start going through it, I'm happy to say. And we'll share details of where it's available from Beacon Press, and it is available now. I'll share details in the chat for people who haven't had a chance to pick it up yet. I urge you. It's actually a wonderful, this way. It's a wonderful holiday gift. So I might as well promote it there now at that interval. Um, for those who don't know, and I'd love a recap myself, especially from someone of the stature of Marcus. Would you mind, Marcus, setting out the context of the historical backdrop to this project before we maybe talk a little bit about the process of it culminating in a graphic novel?
Yes, certainly, Miriam. Thanks to you and Kim. It's wonderful to be with you. It's good to be with David. So yes, this uprising that takes place in New York in 1741, in which the main fighters, shall we say, were enslaved Africans, Irish immigrants, including especially Irish soldiers, and a group of mixed race Cuban sailors who all, by the way, worked together on the waterfront of New York. This is part of a longer book that Peter Linebaugh and I wrote called The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. And what that book sought to do was to show that there was a great deal of cooperation among working people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different races, and that in the period before the hardening of racial categories in the late 18th and early 19th century, there was a lot of space for cooperation. So this is a formative period. The 18th century is the formative period of global capitalism. The workers that we treat in this book are central actors in the rise of capitalism and are also very important actors in terms of resisting it. So basically what Peter and I found and what David and I have now created through this graphic novel is really a portrait of a revolution. It's a revolution on a modest scale, but its goals were actually great. These three groups of people, led, by the way, I might mention, by an African-American man named John Gwin, who was also known by the name of Caesar to his enslaver, and an Irish woman named Margaret Carey, or Peg Carey, who was known variously in New York as Negro Peg, because she had a black lover, but also known as the Newfoundland Irish Beauty. She had sailed from Ireland to Newfoundland, part of the fishing trade, I suspect, and landed in New York. So these two people are leaders of this motley crew who meet in a tavern on the Hudson River, owned by a man named John Hewson. And basically what happens in this tavern is it's kind of a center of the second economy in which people will bring things there to be sold to get money for themselves. But it slowly becomes a site of conspiracy to take over the city of New York and hand it over to the Spanish Empire, which at that time was guaranteeing freedom for all enslaved people who escaped to it from the British Empire. So Spain was seen as kind of a liberator in this situation. To make a long story short, the full revolution never happened. The idea was to set fires and to capture the city with assistance from people from all around the city. That didn't happen because someone broke discipline and started setting the fires too soon. And so the rebels were not really ready to act on it yet. They ended up being defeated by the local militia and the British Army, which had a major place of location there in New York at Fort George. And what resulted afterwards was a massive trial in which the leaders of the rebellion were hanged, but a great many more of the rank and file were both hanged and burned at the stake. So what was of special interest to us was the way in which this rebellion, this popular rebellion from below, uh, signified the kind of brewing resistance that Peter Linebaugh and I found all over the Atlantic world in the 18th and early 19th century. In other words, this is not atypical. An especially important finding was that a lot of the people who ended up in New York taking part in this uprising had already been involved in other kinds of resistance movements elsewhere in the world, in Ireland, in the Caribbean, in other parts of North America. So we were very interested to depict the circulation of subversive experience. And so when David and I had finished our first two graphic novels, we started looking for a third theme. We thought that this particular event was very important because it allows us to both reconstruct and also to imagine how the rebellion unfolded. So it is very much an inside view of what the rebels were thinking.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you for that, Marcus. So can I ask you, David, then, in terms of that early stage, and clearly it's not your first rodeo with Marcus or in general in terms of the graphic novel genre, but for you as an artist and all this historical context, what are the early stages for you, or in terms of kind of, do you immerse yourself in all this history, or can you talk to us a little bit about the early stage of how you come to create these characters in the beautiful way that you have in these pages?
Well, as we've done with our two previous books, I will write, because I'm doing the drawing and everything, I write the initial script. Now, it was based on an outline by Marcus, and he had indicated the main about 8 characters, and he had written little biographies of each of the characters. So I had that to go on, and I had the outline. And so then I started to create the script. How can this be turned into a full-length graphic novel? Because remember, it is only a chapter in Marcus's book and Peter's book, the Many-Headed Hydra. And so in the previous two books that we did together, I had the entirety of Marcus's books to work with in terms of the history all laid out in front of me. So this was a far more challenging book, a far more complex book. And so, the way we write the script is it's very much like a film script. So everything is broken down into numbered scenes, and each scene contains a visual description of how I might approach the action in the film. The action in the graphic novel. But I think very cinematically when I'm creating a graphic novel. So this is how to turn history from below into a cinematic graphic novel experience. And in this case, in glorious black and white, because I feel like that represents history better. I want the reader to go back in time, hundreds of years, and I want them to get a gritty sense of the time period. And also for references, there are no photographs of the 18th century. There are no films. There are no audio clips of all that we have at disposal now. So you have to invent a lot of things. You have to do a lot of reading, a lot of research as to how people looked, how people, what kind of pipes they smoked, what kind of hats, what kind of shoes. You have to, again, like a film, you have to dress the set in a sense. So each panel is full of details that have to be, figured out in advance. So there's a lot of visual research that goes into making a graphic novel. And so and I can talk more about that later, but it's so the initial step is I write the first draft, and then the thing is, it's so fascinating. It's way too long, of course, as most people who write things do. Then I gave it to Marcus, and then we go back and forth over a period of months until we've crafted it down to a reasonable size to create a graphic novel. And this was way longer than our previous books because there was so many characters, and when you're dealing with a conspiracy, you need the room and time to present that conspiracy, and so that's how it unfolded. Because I realized like so much about conspiracies are meetings, and so the other problem with doing a graphic novel is how do you make meetings seem interesting?
Right.
Because it's just people sitting around talking, and so that was a fundamental part of how to present this. But I didn't want to gloss over it because it's the foundation of the uprising, of the revolution. And so I had to allow time for these meetings to take place. And so how do you make it interesting? Well, you make it atmospheric, you make the dialogue interesting, and then you also allow the reader to take the time to go through these meetings and to allow it to unfold and feel the weight of that and how we came to the action that comes later, which is the uprising itself. And I will say that working with Marcus is he's a remarkable collaborator, because it's no small thing to be a great collaborator. And as a musician, I like to say that it's like if you're in a band with other people, it can be great if it clicks, if it works together, then you can have a long history together. But if it doesn't, then it's just a short thing. So there has to be chemistry there in terms of working ability. And so he's remarkable in that way. And I feel very lucky to do. This is our third book. We're working on our fourth book. But I wanted to, just for people who don't necessarily know much about graphic novels, I wanted to introduce the tools used in making a graphic novel. So I have a little demonstration here. Of course, I first should say that many people may think graphic novels are now done on a computer, and many of them are, but in my case, I actually draw everything by hand, except the word balloons and the text, which are added later on the computer. So of course, every drawing in this book begins with a piece of paper, and in order to operate that piece of paper, we need a pencil. And in order to operate that pencil, we do need a pencil sharpener. And once we have our pencil sketch, we then need a pen to ink that pencil sketch. Then we need an eraser to erase those unwanted pencil lines. Okay, then we need a tube of paint. In this case, I use watercolor. And we need a paintbrush, and we paint on those inked drawings. And that is, in essence, how each drawing in this book came to life. And of course, I use other techniques. I like to splatter paint, and I might use a knife and a toothbrush and get some paint going, and then splatter for the effect of creating movement and action on the page. So there are a lot of other sort of more radical usages of paint and line and that sort of thing. I may even rip a drawing up. I may piece it together. There's so just to let people know of how the process of making a book that's 167 pages, how that came to be, and the intensity of creating a book like this. It is a lot of work to draw every single detail of this, and to make it be cohesive. And so that's what everybody who does these books, that's what they're doing. So if they draw it by hand. And I must say that it's been great to tell history from below, to work on these books with Marcus, because I think, to me, in the climate that we live in, it's more essential than ever that we present progressive history, and that people are educated through the reading of these books, and they are being used in schools and that sort of thing. Because history teachers have told me that they're finding that students are less or maybe more unable to read longer texts like long prose books. And so they're finding that teaching history, these graphic novels are becoming more and more essential in interesting students because there's the combination of the text and the visuals, which really connect with younger people. And so it's a really great moment for the written word and visual arts to come together, and history. And so that's why I feel like I've often said this is like to me, the future of activist art. But if anything, it's already happening. It is activist art and history combined. And so I feel like the work that it takes to make these books is well spent. And I feel very happy to be a part of this project and to work with Beacon Press and Marcus and Paul and so that's just in a nutshell a bit of how the book came together and how the process that we work together.
If I could pick up on a theme there,
Mm-hmm.
One of the things Miriam and I have talked a lot about is, in the course of our, talks over the years, is that there aren't a lot of stories out there about Black and Irish relations that are about the cooperative and the forming common cause. And this particular event is so compelling from that point of view, in that it tells this early story, which, as Marcus points out, is before the hardening of racial categories in the US. And so as I'm reading this, you imagine the worlds that didn't happen, because of certain particular historical outcomes, and then what's possible, what it allows us to think about. And so I'm curious, Marcus, what you have to say about how you think the outcome of this rebellion, which ends in, the killing of most involved, what it had to do with the hardening of those racial boundaries. If you can draw something of a particularly straight line between this outcome and that division.
Definitely. Kim, thank you for that good question. Yeah, the thing is that Peter Linebaugh and I found this kind of collaboration, intercultural collaboration, we might say, we found it most everywhere. And we also discovered, and in this case in particular, that elites did not like it. It was very dangerous to them. So they used this occasion, like so many other hundreds and thousands of occasions, to enact a divide and conquer strategy. And very specifically, in this case, what the elites of New York did was to demonize the white people who were part of this interracial uprising, and basically to call them out as race traitors. This is I refer here to the work of Noel Ignatieff, which I hope people know, how the Irish became white, and the journal he published called Race Traitor. And basically the effort was to create new divisions, political divisions, economic divisions, social divisions that would make it harder for people to cooperate over those sorts of obstacles. Now, part of it is just sheer outright terror, right? The hanging of John Hewson, who was the owner of the tippling house, as they called it, sort of the bar where everybody met. They made a very big deal out of hanging him and then putting his body in chains, along with John Gwin, or Caesar, as he was sometimes called. But one of the things we say in the graphic novel is that even in death, the rebels were subversive, because when the dead bodies of Hewson and Gwin were hanged, the white man Hewson, his corpse turned black, and the black man Gwin, his corpse turned white, and people flocked from all around to see what they called a miracle. So this, I thought, was a powerful example of the permeability of racial lines and categories. And I'll just mention one more. We have in the record an Irishman named David Johnson, who is in Houston's Tavern, and he proposes a toast, which is to burn the town and kill the white people, of which he did not consider himself to be one. Actually, a fairly common definition of white in those days referred to the wealthy people who did not work in the sun. So they were white-skinned in ways that people who worked outdoors were not. So again, we were very interested, David and I, to make this rebellion, which is really kind of hard for people to imagine today. I once gave a talk about this many years ago, this particular event, and there was a fair amount of resistance to the interpretation. And I asked a friend of mine who happened to be African American why he thought there was such resistance. He said, because the people in the room couldn't imagine interracial cooperation. That's what they didn't like about it. They didn't believe it was possible. But again, the power of this book depends on David's ability to translate these very complex social realities into images. And I do want to emphasize that David is not just a brilliant artist. He is also a translator of the text of the story into images that give the story new power, not just new life, but new power, because people can see things in this book that they can't see in that chapter of the Many-Headed Hydra. What conspiracy looks like, what resistance looks like, how it feels, what are the emotions of it through the characters. And David, I did just want to ask you, do you know how many distinct images you drew in creating this book?
It's incredible.
I do indeed.
How many was it?
There are about 800
Wow.
images. So this book represents about 800 drawings, because my method of putting it together is I draw until I'm happy with the drawing, and then I take that drawing and then scan it and then design it on the page. So that's very different from the way a lot of other graphic novelists work, where they do draw the whole page as is in one go. So essentially kind of one drawing, but mine is made up of multiples, as I said, 800. And so it's a daunting task to begin a book when you know, oh my God, I've got to make 800 drawings. It's like, good Jesus. It's like, how can I do that? Where's the stamina to do that? Because it takes a great deal of focus, and one is very self-critical as you go through. And the sequences must work in a graphic novel form. And so that's my approach to it. And it is a form of translation, absolutely, is how to take this history. And as particularly where this one, as we keep going back to, it is a conspiracy involving many people from many different communities. So there's the characters, there's their relationships between them, there is their own personal histories, and their cultural backgrounds. And so all of this is part of the book. And so I consulted cinema, as I often do. And so in this case, I looked for films that did depict conspiracies of different kinds. And one of them was a great film called Matewan by the director John Sayles from 1987. There's also Ken Loach's film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley from, I think it's 2006, about the Irish War of Independence. And the Matewan film was about the coal miners' uprising in West Virginia in the coal mine wars. And finally, Costa Gavras' State of Siege from 1972, which depicted a kidnapping by the Tupamaro guerrilla group, but there were a lot of meetings, clandestine meetings there as part of it. And I wanted to see how great filmmakers depicted the idea of conspiracy. And so that informed how I would depict it. And they didn't shy away from the idea of people sitting around gathering in locations. And in our case, it's the 18th century. So people are in, there's the moonlight of meeting on the waterfront. There's the candles in a tavern. There's oil lamps in a home. And so the idea of the darkness of rooms, that gave for me a certain atmosphere that I could create as an artist to try to show how the conspiracy grew out of what I call the shadows, and the people who are at the bottom of society attempting to rise up. And so and I was influenced also by visual art of Rembrandt's etchings and by Goya's The Disasters of War, and also a particular print by Katie Kollwitz, the German artist, of her depiction of a revolt by the weavers in the 1890s. And there was just this great image she had from a series that she did, which was just a group of people in a tavern in darkness, only lit by a candle on their table, and they were conspiring their revolt. And I just found it very powerful. And so the imagery of the idea of out of the shadows comes the revolutionary, out of the shadows comes the uprising. And so I had that thought with me throughout the creation of this book, and I kept going back and looking at that drawing for inspiration. And that's what propelled me to make 800 drawings.
And I just want to take the opportunity because you mentioned the cinematic element, like this opening image after the map. I'm not doing justice to it here, as a full page spread of, opening up. And then the reason you have 800 is because some of the pages are like this as well. So an incredible amount of detail and work. The kind of intercultural dimension to it, David, in terms of rendering the how people looked and everything. Was that difficult for you, or painstaking? Did you think long and hard about how you depicted people?
Well, interesting that you mentioned that, because I have something to show you. Because in the process of drawing characters for, again, 167 pages, is how do you keep that fresh? How do you keep the visual perspectives of people's faces and such? So what I have done is create something to help me draw, and that is create clay models of some of the characters in the book. And I'll just quickly show you a few. So, and this is for the purposes of drawing. I don't know whether you can see very well, but this is John Gwin, an early version of him. And so it's out of clay, and it means that I can draw from any angle, and I can also control the light source. So, so it's very helpful. That's John Gwin. And then we have the tavern owner, John Hewson. Again, it's really great to be able to do that from any angle. And we have Quack, who set the uprising prematurely in motion. And finally, we can't leave out the ruling class. We have the governor, Clark, here. So, sorry, this is hard to do. So anyway, these are part of how how I go back to as a reference, because in previous books, in the pirate book, I actually built with a partner a full replica of a galleon, and which took about 7 months, and in order to draw from, and so I find creating these heads is very useful, and I did the same with our book on Benjamin Lay, which is our first book together. So so yes, that's the idea of how to present these things, the text, how to translate it into a book that is engaging and visually compelling is something that one is always constantly thinking of when you look at a scene. You may have an idea of how the scene should go, but it's very different from when you actually pick up that pencil and start drawing. And a lot of thought goes into how you want to do it, but then it also alters as you go, as you see what you produced and you see how it could work together dynamically. And I'm always thinking, and you pointed out the opening spread, it's really great to have a 2-page spread, but it's also great to go into a lot of detail And with this particular book, as I keep going back to the idea that it was very complex because of so many characters, and so much nuance to present to the reader. I found that for the first time ever that I introduced the idea of a narrator to try to hold the thread of the entire book together, and to a way of giving information and setting the scene, so that we can dive right into the book and get right into the action without going, oh, where are we at right now? So that was a kind of an innovation for me, which I had always kind of resisted, because I always thought everything should be purely visual and unfold that way. But you realize with history, it's so complex, you really do need to give the reader a lot to work with, and you don't have endless pages. So you realize with a graphic novel, you tend to be concise and get to the point, and that's what I had to do with this book, but also allow for moments of contemplation for the reader to slow down, to stop, to look at the drawings. And that's another thing I like visually to present in a book, is how can I stop the reader from just simply reading the word balloons? And so part of that is I have a technique of cutting up the drawing. So instead of looking at one drawing, you're looking at maybe 3 or 4. You have to stop. It slows you down. And so so sometimes there are purely visual sequences in the book to slow the reader down, to contemplate, and to enjoy the book in that way rather than race through it. And so these are all the things that go through the mind when you're creating something like that. It isn't just following the script and going, one after another, this happens. There's a lot of rhythm to a book. And people can see right away, they can flip through and go, you can't do that with a prose book. You can't tell what the rhythm of a prose book is, because it's just a bunch of words on a paper, And so this has a lot of challenges, and it's also a very exciting way to present, as I said, history, and particularly our focus, which is history from below.
Can I ask?
Can I
Sorry. Sure.
Can I describe the feeling that I often have when I see David's creation of images that correspond to the text that I wrote? Okay.
Yeah.
The best way for me to describe this is to tell a story about the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. I'm sure everybody knows him. He was once sitting in a group of translators, and they were translating one of his poems. And at one point, he jumps to his feet and he says, "That's much better than what I wrote. Keep that." Keep that. That's the way I often feel when I see David's images. That's much better than what we wrote. Let's go with that. So it's very good to have both these ways of communicating knowledge. And what David does, as you can tell by the sophisticated way that he talks about his work, is very complex translation and rendition of images and ideas. And I'm also especially happy to have this kind of conversation because David and I are both very interested in labor history. And there is a labor history of creating these graphic novels. And he just showed you some of the tools of the trade. So I think that helps to demystify the process a little bit and make people see this as a human creation.
Which is, I so appreciate, both as a teacher who definitely sees the effect of too many screens on students' ability to read complex texts now. But I love the use of the models, because that's one of my questions was how do you continue to draw the same person distinctly over all of these? Right, that's really helpful. But in thinking about the arc of the story as presented here, we begin in 1791 and we end in 1791. And, there's sort of the continuity is through sort of the legacy of John and Peg's daughter. Yes, or do I have that right? Or the ancestry. Can you say a bit more about the significance of 1791 in this story historically and its aftermath?
Shall I start, David?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
1791 is the year the Haitian Revolution breaks out. So one of the things that the Many-Headed Hydra is about, in which this and also which Revolution by Fire is about, is the unknown continuities of resistance and revolution. So the truth is there are these mobile carriers of knowledge, subversive knowledge. A classic example of this idea was delivered by a friend of mine named Julius Scott, who wrote a book called The Common Wind, which is about how sailors and dock workers and market women, mobile people, spread the word of the Haitian Revolution during the 1790s. And what he reveals is a network of working class people that no one had ever been able to tap into before. We think the world consists of texts and texts only, right? David Graeber, the anthropologist, had a hilarious comment where he says, we sometimes think that civilization is just people sitting around and reading each other's books. Of course, that's not the way any society is organized or how history happens. It happens through conflicts and the things, but to 1791 was chosen. David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 1791 was chosen to convey the continuities of resistance. In other words, the reason why it comes up in the graphic novel is because the many-headed hydra is rearing its head in the Caribbean at that time. And so here is its prehistory in 1741. So, David, what would you add to that?
Well, that's exactly it. And in fact, we end the final panel of the book. It ends with Peg's daughter, Peg and John's daughter, saying, "We are the keepers of the common story." And the whole idea of the epilogue of the book is that the common story carries on. There's the thread that goes through it. So we approach, we're in 1791, and it begins again. And so the linkage the book ends on a point of optimism, in my view, as the resistance continues. And so the thread from the beginning of the book to the end is there, and we see how important understanding history is to continuing the thread of resistance and seeing where that goes. And so that's why we deliberately chose to end in that way. And so to me, it's a very positive aspect of the book.
I just wanted to, we're kind of at the 45-minute mark, and Bruce Rosen here, thank you, Bruce, for posing a question. It's kind of tangential to something I was thinking of asking Marcus too. So his question is, Mr. Lester has described the classic process of writing a book. I'm wondering if Marcus goes through similar steps to paint history. And I suppose what I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, Marcus, is and the book is bookended really nicely with I don't know whether you call it a foreword from yourself, Marcus, and an afterword from Paul Boole. And in it you reference the primary source that informed I believe much of what you imagine and write about here, the legal documents from Judge Daniel Horsmond, and if I'm pronouncing his name, and I'm thinking of, you translating, these legal documents from the 18th century into historical prose, and now you and David in particular with his artistry, rendering them in another way. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I'd be happy to. It's a really interesting question for me. Autobiographically, I almost went into art history.
Oh.
I always loved art history. I decided to go into sort of regular American history, which became Atlantic history, because I felt like it was more of a political fight over the meaning of the past in the United States. But I always had a great deal of interest in images. And every one of my book has got a kind of a set of images which try, I don't know how often they succeed, to recap the argument of a book, So there's someone just looks, so David, this is in response to your question. Someone looks through a book like The Many-Headed Hydra and sees the illustrations on the page and looks only at the illustrations. Hopefully at the end of the book, they have some idea of what the book is about. So I love that phrase, paint history. And actually in my more recent work, I think I have tried more self-consciously to paint history in the sense that I've always had this, I'm not sure I've ever said this before, but I've always had this great desire to write history in the way that Caravaggio painted his paintings with great dynamic contrasts, with social drama, with heightened psychological intensity of the moment of what's happening, in which you are there in that moment. You know, whatever it may be that Caravaggio is painting, you, the viewer, are brought into the scene, really, whether you like it or not. There's usually several people directly looking at you as the viewer, inviting you in, or maybe even demanding that you enter when you don't want to. So, of course, I don't pretend that I am anything like Caravaggio, who was possibly the greatest painter of all time, but I do strive for that human reality in which we can recognize people in struggle. The great historian George Rawick, who is a historian of slavery and a very close colleague of C.L.R. James, he once said to me, any history in which working people cannot recognize themselves is bad history. And so I think David and I have tried to produce a book in which working people like us, can see themselves that, yeah, what would I have done in that situation? I see why all the people in that tavern hate the British Empire. They have slightly different reasons for hating it, but they all hate it. So this is, to me, it's that kind of way of painting history that I strive for. It's hard to do, but if you concentrate on the stories, that, like the 1741 event is a big complex story. I think people, by real persons in real time making real life and death decisions, I think that can help you to paint it, and paint it in terms that people can identify with.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Marcus. And I'm selfishly really glad you didn't become an art historian, because I'm really glad you got into what you did. What actually, there's a message here from Michael Flumian. Thank you, Michael. Placing history is also important. Love the map at the beginning for geographic context. I love that too. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, David? Or what I wanted to ask you, is there any one page or image that like kept you up at night? Or is there one that you love, one you really hate, or one you really love, or something? Where is there any fun stories in terms of that part of the process?
Well, it's hard to just, one thing which is always I'm appreciative is getting the reaction of Marcus from the pages, from the draft that I finally send him to look at it, because it's a long process of back and forth, the script, but then also when the thing is all put together as a book, and then we have to go over it and see if there's any changes and stuff like that. But one of the things that I was very, which was a terrible part of the book, which was the execution, one of the mass executions of the conspirators, and it's like a question of how do you depict stuff like that, because it's so grim and awful. What can you do with it that isn't again exploitative or just weird? And so one of it is there's going to be a mass hanging, and so you have the people with the nooses around their necks, and then you turn the page and you just see their feet hanging, you do not show everything else. And I recall, as you probably remember, Marcus, is that he particularly liked that transition. So you turn the page, and it's just the sense of what happened to these people in silhouette, really. And so that to me was a powerful moment to figure out how to depict. But also, I was very happy that Marcus, related to that in the sense of thinking that was a powerful image and a great way to present that. And so that's one that stands out to me. But it's weird for me, to look at the book. All I see is all the work that went into it. And so that's very hard to have the distance from it. And you go, oh my God, like what? Look at all that detail. What crazy person did that? And so anyway, I was also going to make one point about Caravaggio. I love his work as well, and there's a real sense of movement to it, to Caravaggio's paintings, and I really do like that. Going back to what Marcus was saying about writing the prose books, is that I often judge a book by the first opening paragraph. And when I was contacted to work with Marcus, I read his book on Benjamin Lay, and I loved it immediately because Marcus took in my view, a very cinematic opening to a big important scene in Benjamin Lay's life. And I thought, this guy is great. He knows what he's doing. He visually is representing it. And he did the same in Villains of All Nations, the book on pirates, a very cinematic opening. And so I thought, this is a person you want to work with, somebody who understands the dynamic of telling history, using words to paint a picture, and that I can relate to. And so that began, how we ended up, again, our origins of working together on 3 books and a 4th one. And so I don't know, I forgot where we started with this, but that's anyway, just some thoughts that I'm going through my head in listening to Marcus and your question.
No, that's and thank you for sharing. That image is so powerful. Kim, you want to come in there?
Yeah, and in response to Michael's point about the map, I'm currently in Lower Manhattan, and I'm wondering if I go down to Magazine Street, am I going to see any commemoration of the burial ground of Black conspirators there? Is there anything marking this in the landscape now?
I don't think so, Kim. I don't think so. But if this book could interest people and make that happen, I would be very happy. I'm sure David would too. And I will mention that we have had that kind of outcome in the past. There's now a historical marker where Benjamin Lay, the radical Quaker abolitionist, once lived. And that landscape had been scrubbed of his history and his impact. So it is possible to bring these things back. And, if you know anybody who wants to work on that, let us know.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing. We're kind of coming towards the end of time. And if anyone has, I think I've picked up any of the comments and questions. And I've shared the link to Beacon did a lovely job on it as well. And the publication part of it is really great. If anyone wants to pick it up, just go to the Beacon Press website. From our perspective, we're really, really grateful that you've shared the background and context to all your work on this. Part of our remit with Black, Brown and Green Voices and with African American Irish Diaspora Network is really the term that keeps coming to me when both you're speaking, Marcus and David, is complicating our interpretations of the past, just being a bit more holding to things. A lot of the time, what we try to do in amplifying the stories, and to mark the points of conflict between African Americans and Irish Americans, because we don't want to deny those things happen too, but to add more nuance as well to the ways in which these communities and peoples came together in very human ways. I love the bedroom scene, David. I think you did such a great job on that. It's wonderful, and I'm sure the teenage readers will enjoy that part of it in their boring history class. But I cannot commend this anymore. It's a really I really recommend everyone who's here, by virtue of you being here, please pick up a copy of this book. And I really hope there's an Irish dimension to your next graphic novel. And Marcus, you're so inspiring as well. I just want to say this in a somewhat public forum, because I know not only do you write amazing history books, amazing prose, but you do this. And I know that you've been very involved in demonstrating history through a play format as well. What can I maybe just ask you before we close out? Is it just this kind of expanding your audience that motivates you, or just your own creativity in terms of going on beyond just the footnotes and citations of a manuscript?
Well, look, this very session is an excellent example of why I want to try my hand at different genres and different ways of presenting history from below. You can't imagine how much I've learned from David.
Right.
I mean, and to me, the key of this kind of collaboration is finding the right people. I've worked with the brilliant filmmaker Tony Buba. We've made one documentary. We're going to make another one. I wrote the play with Naomi Wallace, a really gifted playwright. Working with David and Paul, it just it keeps you active and keeps you searching for new ways of expressing deep things. And you know, as soon as I saw David's graphic history of the Winnipeg strike of 1919, I said, this is the guy I want to work with right here. This is somebody who's going to really understand the history from below that I do. And it's just been a great voyage. He's my shipmate. And we've had really great times working on this. And the other thing is, it's well, David mentioned, you know, the gift of being a good collaborator, but he couldn't be better. I mean, we've done I've done all these books with great joy and very little conflict, and with a lot of mutual respect. So anyone who wants to try to do this thing, this kind of thing, find the people in which you have a sort of a deep commonality of vision, and just enjoy the creativity that can come from it.
That's a really great place to end, Marcus. And I think that energy, genuinely, I think that energy comes across on the pages. You've just kind of hit the nail in the head in terms of what jumps out at you as you're reading it. So, bravi, I should say, to both of you. And thank you again for joining us today. We have a transatlantic kind of audience engaging with this, and the amazing technology of Zoom that we're in Ireland, New York. Actually, I don't know, Marcus, are you back from Hawaii? Where are you?
I'm in Pittsburgh now.
You're in Pittsburgh, and David's all the way from Vancouver. So thank you so much. And Kim, thank you for being on with us again today. And we look forward to further engagements in the future. Thank you for joining in, folks, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.